Aloha. Welcome to Light Drama Action. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe. And let's get to the content for today. Peace.
Before we begin, I want to offer a clear and firm warning. What you're about to hear contains graphic descriptions. These are not dramatizations, but actual testimony given under oath. This content is intended for mature audiences only. Listener discretion is strongly advised. And remember, all individuals mentioned in this video, including Mr. Combs, are presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. If you're joining us for the first time, full summaries for days 1 through 17 are available on the video tab of this channel. Day 18. The sole witness takes the stand. Testifying under the pseudonym Jane, the 31-year-old former girlfriend of the hip-hop mogul arrived in a tailored maroon pantsuit, her posture tense but determined. As she took the stand, Jane's hands trembled ever so slightly. It was a fleeting gesture of poise that belied the emotional turmoil evident in her eyes. Jane's role in Combs' life had been intimate and secretive. An ex-lover whose relationship with the defendant spanned from 2020 until just weeks before his arrest in late 2024. Across the room at the defense table sat Sean Diddy Combs, the Grammy-winning music impresario, now a stone-faced defendant. As Jane raised her right hand and swore to tell the truth, Combs' expression hardened. He folded his arms tightly and leaned forward on the table, gaze locked on the witness stand. For much of the day, his face remained a rigid mask, though now and then his fingers drummed restlessly against his bicep. Having been admonished by the judge only a day earlier for trying to silently signal the jury, Combs was careful to stifle any overt reaction. Arrayed beside Combs was his high-powered defense team, a phalanx of attorneys versed in high-stakes trials. Lead counsel Mark Agnifilo sat at Combs' right, periodically leaning in to confer whenever Jane's testimony struck a nerve. To Combs' left, Brian Steele listened intently, occasionally scribbling notes, while another attorney, Alexandra Shapiro, hovered just behind, ready with thick binders of evidence. At times during Jane's testimony, Combs would turn to his lawyers and whisper urgently, his hands gesturing in frustration as if to contest the witness's words. By contrast, the defense team's demeanor toward the witness was notably icy. For long stretches, none of Combs' lawyers even looked directly at Jane, choosing instead to stare at their monitors displaying a live transcript of her words. Only when an objection was needed did an attorney's voice break the silence, punctuating Jane's narrative with legal challenges. On the prosecution side, Assistant U.S. Attorney Maureen Comey rose to question Jane, projecting a calm, authoritative presence. Comey's tone was steady and empathetic as she guided the witness through her story, but her questions were pointed, each designed to unearth another layer of Combs' alleged pattern of abuse. The courtroom itself was hushed and rapt. Jurors leaned forward in their leather-backed chairs, some frowning, others casting sidelong glances at the impassive defendant. A few spectators in the gallery clutched the edges of their seats. Even the usually stoic court officers appeared grim as Jane began detailing the disturbing secret life she says she led at Combs' behest. Revelations of a love contract. Under gentle direct examination, Jane painted a picture of a relationship that started like a fairy tale and ended as a nightmare. She described meeting Combs and being swept off her feet. He was charming, attentive, and extravagantly generous at first. Their romance was passionate and exciting, sometimes taboo, she admitted, using a careful euphemism to hint at the sexual adventures that initially thrilled her. But as months passed, Combs' requests grew ever more extreme and coercive. The jury learned of a love contract the couple verbally agreed to in early 2023, an arrangement Jane testified was nothing short of Faustian. In exchange for her continued loyalty and silence, Combs would pay her a stipend of $10,000 a month. This lavish allowance came with an expectation, complete obedience to Combs' sexual demands. Even now, as she sat in court testifying against him, Combs was still depositing money each month to cover her rent, Jane revealed, her voice tinged with lingering disbelief. It was as if the golden shackles of that agreement remained fastened, a fact that prompted a ripple of astonishment across the courtroom. Several jurors traded surprised looks upon hearing that the defendant was effectively bankrolling the very witness who could help put him in prison. Jane explained that the love contract marked a turning point in the relationship. From then on, every encounter with Combs came with strings attached. Each time I saw him after that, I was forced to perform sex acts with other men. She testified matter-of-factly, then paused, swallowing hard at the memory. If she hesitated or resisted these arranged trysts, which Combs euphemistically called hotel nights or freak-offs, he would respond with thinly veiled threats. In one text message from 2023 displayed on the courtroom screens, Jane had pleaded with Combs, "I don't want to feel obligated to perform these nights with you in fear of losing the roof over my head." The reply from Combs flashed in bold letters, "Girl, stop!" The curt message from the defendant drew a sharp intake of breath from a few people in the gallery. Jane's jaw tightened as she recited his dismissive words. It was an SMS slap in the face, a reminder of how Combs allegedly dangled her financial security over her head to ensure her compliance. According to Jane, Combs' control over her life was all-encompassing. He even took issue with her appearance. At one point, Combs decided he disliked Jane's teeth and orchestrated a full dental makeover, sending her to a specific Beverly Hills cosmetic dentist for a new set of veneers, all on his dime. "He wanted me to have the perfect smile for him," she said quietly. The prosecution used this anecdote to illustrate how Combs' wealth enabled him to micromanage and mold Jane to his preferences, both in body and behavior. She was living in a luxury cage of his making. As midday approached, legal sparring erupted between the attorneys over the scope of Jane's testimony. Combs' lawyers argued strenuously against the introduction of certain evidence, notably a cache of text messages and notes spanning several years that prosecutors said would corroborate Jane's story. In a sidebar conference, defense attorney Mark Agnifilo complained that the government intended to dredge up 6 years of unrelated messages to paint his client in a bad light. The prosecutors countered that these communications, including exchanges between Combs' personal assistants, were highly relevant to establishing an organized pattern of illicit conduct. Presiding Judge Arun Subramanian weighed each argument. At length, he ruled that the evidence would be allowed insofar as it was directly pertinent to Jane's allegations. The parameters set, the trial resumed, and Jane steeled herself to continue, now delving into the most explosive revelations of the day: freak-offs, dark secrets of the hotel nights. What followed was testimony so graphic and disturbing that a palpable pall fell over the courtroom. Combs had a predilection for hiring male sex workers and making Jane perform with them while he watched. He called these sessions his freak-offs, she said, as if they were festive escapades, but to her they became ordeals that pushed her body and psyche beyond their limits. Jane testified that in the beginning, she went along with Combs' voyeuristic fantasies, down for the threesomes at first, but the threesomes soon became foursomes, then more. Their frequency escalated alarmingly. They became far too frequent, she explained. If she ever balked or showed reluctance, Combs would get agitated, pressuring her until she capitulated. He insisted that Jane herself be the one to procure the male entertainers, so she would make the bookings at his direction, with Combs footing the bill for each escort services. These arrangements left Jane feeling complicit in her own degradation. The freak-offs often lasted 24 to 30 hours at a stretch, sometimes even longer. In one extreme instance, Jane endured a single continuous session that spanned 3.5 days, an ordeal of excess that left her utterly exhausted and dazed. "He wanted me to be wild and sexual," Jane said of Combs' instructions during these marathons. Combs' preferred routine, according to Jane, was chilling. He would sit off to the side or hover nearby, watching intently as Jane had intercourse with the hired men for hours on end, all while Combs gratified himself. Often he filmed or took photos. At times, he even requested that Jane obtain photographs of the male escort's genitals in advance, previewing the men he was about to invite into their bed. Jane's voice quavered as she recounted how Combs seemed to revel in the voyeuristic details. He was infatuated with certain acts and would issue specific orders, and no condoms, certain positions, particular finishes, all calculated to satisfy his own lurid fantasies. Indeed, contraception was forbidden in Combs' fantasy sessions. In a hushed courtroom, the jury listened to an audio recording from one of the early hotel nights. The scratchy recording captured Jane's trembling voice asking a male escort to, "Please, put on a condom." The escort was willing. "Okay," a man's voice replied, but then another voice cut in sharply. The courtroom recognized it at once as Combs' distinctive baritone. On the tinny recording, Combs barked an angry refusal. Jane's voice cracked audibly as she pleaded, "You promised," but Combs overrode her, effectively forbidding protection. Later, Jane explained to the jury that Combs guilt tripped her out of it. He did not want to see a rubber while watching, she said. The defendant's preference was for unprotected sex, no matter Jane's discomfort or the risks involved. In the recording, Combs can be heard commanding her in a cold drawl, "You are just taking that. Don't ruin the moment." A few jurors shifted in their seats at this, one covering his mouth as if in shock. Throughout these sessions, Combs plied Jane with copious amounts of drugs and alcohol to ensure her compliance and endurance. "It was all very drug-fueled," she testified. He would regularly run out of drugs mid-session and simply dispatch one of his security guards or personal assistants to fetch more from his stash. Jane described hotel suite doors swinging open in the dead of night as Combs' staff arrived bearing pill bottles filled with ecstasy tablets, cocaine, and a potent blend of cannabis and tobacco, whatever vices were required to keep the marathon rolling. When exhaustion inevitably set in, a drug dealer, identified only as Guido, would sometimes be summoned with Xanax to force a crash. "You need something really heavy to knock you out," Jane recalled the dealer saying, explaining that she would take a Xanax dose after I put Sean to sleep. There were nights, Jane admitted, that she herself asked Combs for ecstasy just to numb her senses enough to get through the ordeal. The prosecution underscored this point to show the level of dependency and control. Combs had fostered an environment where drugs became Jane's only way to tolerate what he was demanding of her. Jane recounted one especially nightmarish freak-off that occurred in early 2023 on a trip that was originally supposed to be a romantic getaway. Combs had invited her on a luxurious beach vacation to make amends after a rough patch in their relationship. She showed the jury smiling photos from that trip, Combs and Jane cuddling on a sunny sand beach, appearing like any happy couple. "It was supposed to be just us," she said softly, but soon after their arrival at the tropical resort, Combs grew restless. Without warning, he flew in a male escort who doubled as a personal trainer to join them. What Jane had hoped would be a loving reunion spiraled into yet another freak-off, one of the most grueling she ever endured. Over the next day, behind the closed doors of their beachfront suite, Jane was made to have sex with that escort for over 24 hours straight, while Combs alternated between watching, directing, and occasionally participating. Jane's voice fell to a near whisper as she described the aftermath. "I was extremely sore at this point," she confessed, her eyes welling with tears. When asked by the prosecutor what state she was in, Jane answered candidly, "Physically, I could barely move. Emotionally, I felt broken." After that session, she could not stop crying from the pain and humiliation. Combs' reaction, she said, was chillingly nonchalant. He became irritated with her tears. "He scolded me for crying," Jane recalled. In fact, after one particularly brutal encounter as she sobbed in the bathroom, Combs snapped at her, "Don't do that right now. I can't do this right now. I'm too high." He was too high on drugs to even comfort her, she explained, or perhaps simply unwilling. Another incident left an indelible mark on Jane's psyche. She and Combs had vowed to attempt a period of sobriety for the sake of their health. Jane was worried the nonstop drugs might kill him, or herself, or both. Combs agreed to quit drugs for 1 month on one condition, that they have one final epic binge, a sort of twisted going away party for their addictions. Jane reluctantly consented. In July 2023, by Combs' design, they booked a suite at the upscale L'Hermitage Hotel in Beverly Hills for this sobriety party. True to form, Combs immediately arranged for multiple male escorts to join them. This time, Determined to prove to him and herself that she could reclaim some control, Jane attempted to get through the marathon completely sober. No ecstasy, no coke, just sheer willpower. It was a disaster. As the hotel room spun around her in the throes of a 12 to 18-hour ordeal, Jane's body began to give out. After enduring sex with two different men in succession, she ran to the bathroom and violently vomited into the toilet. She testified that Combs found her there collapsed and wiping bile from her mouth. She told him she had gotten sick. Rather than show concern, Combs seemed almost pleased. "That's good," he said, according to Jane's testimony. You'll feel better now that you've thrown up. Third guy's here." An audible gasp escaped from one corner of the gallery at this point, and a juror covered her eyes. Jane described how she was then ordered back to the bedroom to sexually service a third man waiting in the next room, even as her stomach still churned and her eyes were bleary with tears. She obeyed. By the end of that so-called party, Jane was so physically and emotionally wrecked that she could not hold back her tears. When Combs noticed her crying quietly, he became angry that she was killing the vibe. That was when he reprimanded her and blamed the drugs. He was too high to deal with her emotions. The implication was clear. Sean Combs wanted no interruptions to his pleasure, no reminders of the human cost of his fantasies. As Jane delved deeper into these harrowing accounts, her composure began to fray. Up to this point, she had spoken in a measured voice, determined to get through her story, but describing how Combs ignored her pleas for mercy and basic decency finally cracked the facade. Her emotions overtook her when she recounted how she tried to signal to Combs that she couldn't go on. "I gave subtle cues," she said, voice trembling. She told him she was tired, hungry. She would make pained faces and shaking gestures, all hints that she was at her breaking point, but Combs callously pushed her further. "He told me to finish strong." At those words, Jane's resolve faltered. She lowered her head and began to sob openly on the stand. Assistant U.S. Attorney Comey paused her questioning to allow the witness a moment to collect herself. The judge inclined his head sympathetically and offered Jane a tissue from the bench. In the otherwise silent courtroom, the only sounds were Jane's muffled sobs and the soft shuffling of papers as a few jurors reached for their own tissues. After several seconds, Jane attempted to continue. "Why didn't you tell him? No. Stop it outright," Prosecutor Comey asked gently, echoing what everyone in the courtroom must have wondered. Jane looked up, tears streaming down her cheeks, mascara blotching beneath her eyes. Her answer came haltingly between sobs. I don't know," she cried. "I was scared. I loved him. I don't know." The raw anguish in her voice laid bare the confusing tangle of fear, love, and psychological manipulation that had trapped her in these situations. Even Sean Combs, who had sat impassively through most of the testimony, appeared to avert his gaze during this emotional crescendo. He shifted in his seat and stared hard at the surface of the defense table, jaw clenched. One of his attorneys subtly slid a glass of water toward him, and Combs took a slow sip, perhaps to steady himself. Across the room, a few jurors exchanged looks of empathy as Jane wept. Not a soul in the courtroom was left unmoved. After a brief recess to allow Jane to regain her composure, the testimony resumed with heavy solemnity. Jane continued, her voice quieter now but resolute. She described the physical toll that the freak-offs had taken on her body. "I started getting constant back pain," she testified. She suffered frequent urinary tract infections, agonizing UTIs that flared up after the marathons involving multiple partners, as well as persistent soreness and trauma to her most intimate areas. As she cataloged these ailments, Jane dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, wiping away tears. Members of the jury visibly winced. One woman on the panel pressed a hand to her mouth as if holding back emotion. Jane admitted that she often fought to block out how sad I was after each encounter. The only silver lining she clung to, a heartbreaking insight into her mindset, was that after the degrading spectacle ended, Sean Combs would finally spend time alone with her. Paradoxically, those stolen private moments cuddling with him after everyone else left were what she valued most. "I would endure it because I valued time alone with Sean afterward," Jane said, her voice small but clear. She loved him, she reiterated. She craved the tender, normal intimacy that only came after she had allowed herself to be debased for his enjoyment. It was a cruel bargain. The very man orchestrating her pain was also the one whose affection she desperately sought. The prosecution highlighted a series of text messages and personal notes to lay bare Jane's internal struggle during this period. One particularly poignant exhibit was a draft message from November 2021 found in the Notes app on Jane's phone, a message she wrote to Combs but never sent. In it, Jane had poured out her despair and budding defiance. "I'm sorry," she had typed. "I don't want to do drugs for days and days and have you use me to fulfill your freaky wild desires in hotel rooms." Displayed on the courtroom screen, those words read like a cry for freedom from a gilded cage. Jane explained that she lost the courage to send that note at the time she feared angering Combs or being cast out of his life and his penthouse. Years later, however, in spring 2023, her resolve hardened. She actually texted Combs directly, telling him she deeply regretted ever getting involved in the hotel nights and longed to return to the loving, monogamous early days of their relationship. In one message, she confessed, "My heart is really in this and it's breaking." It was as much an admission of heartbreak as a plea for change. Combs' reply was curt and patronizing. "Girl, stop." Hearing that short text aloud in court, Jane let out a rueful chuckle, a brittle, sad sound, as if even she couldn't believe she once accepted such dismissiveness. "That was his attitude," she said. "No matter how much I begged or tried to explain how dark and sleazy it felt to me, he would shut me down." Indeed, earlier, Jane had testified that whenever she broached the subject of ending the freak-offs, Combs refused to discuss it. He would stonewall or threaten until she dropped the subject. The prosecution emphasized this to show how coercive and one-sided the arrangement was. Jane felt she couldn't opt out without severe repercussions. The defense strikes back, cross-examination showdown. By late afternoon, Jane's direct testimony drew to a close. She had spent the entire day methodically laying out her story, every revelation building on the last. Nicole Westmoreland, one of Combs' attorneys, rose to conduct the cross. A poised woman with a steely demeanor, Westmoreland wasted no time in adopting an aggressive posture. She approached the podium, fixed Jane with a cool stare, and in a voice dripping with skepticism, launched her first question. "Jane," she began, pointedly using the pseudonym with a hint of disdain, "you testified that you loved my client, correct?" Jane blinked, slightly taken aback by the bluntness. "Yes," she answered quietly, "I did love him." Westmoreland seized on the response. "In fact, you loved him so much that even after these alleged incidents, these terrible things you described, you continued to see him, travel with him, even attend parties with him. Isn't that true?" "Yes," she admitted, but Westmoreland interrupted before Jane could qualify her answer. The defense's tactic was clear. Portray Jane as a willing girlfriend, not a victim, and suggest that her testimony was a distorted revenge or a grab for money. Over the next tense hour, Westmoreland's cross-examination bore down on inconsistencies and points of doubt. The attorney projected friendly text messages Jane had sent to Combs that seemed at odds with someone living in fear. One was a bubbly note from late 2022 where Jane messaged, "Miss you, babe. Can't wait for our trip. It's gonna be wild." Another showed her playfully joking with Combs about a wild night being fire. Westmoreland had Jane confirm she authored each one. The implication landed. How could these cheery exchanges coexist with the horrific narrative Jane presented in court? Combs' lawyers tried to assail her credibility by highlighting moments where she appeared affectionate and compliant, suggesting she had misrepresented the nature of their relationship. "You never once wrote him that you were disgusted or felt abused, did you?" Westmoreland pressed, pacing before the jury. Jane countered calmly that she had expressed her feelings, if not bluntly in those texts, then in other ways. Pointing again to the unsent note and the 2023 texts where she begged to stop hotel nights. But Westmoreland was already pivoting to a new line of attack. The defense attorney questioned why Jane never fled or sought help during those marathon sessions. There were other people around, these escorts, hotel staff. You had a phone. You could have called 911 or left the hotel at any time. Isn't that right? She demanded. Jane hesitated, clearly grappling with how to explain the psychological cage she'd been in. I didn't think I could, she said finally. Westmoreland pounced. So it was your choice to stay because you didn't want anyone to know. Understood. The lawyer's clipped phrasing made Jane's continued presence sound almost voluntary. A few jurors frowned, parsing the exchange. Next, Westmoreland turned to the financial entanglements. With an arched eyebrow, she asked, Mr. Combs paid your rent for over a year, correct? Yes. He bought you expensive gifts? Like luxury vacations, jewelry, even new teeth? Yes, Jane replied, bristling slightly at the mention of her veneers. Westmoreland let that sink in, then delivered a pointed question. All that support ended when he was arrested, didn't it? Jane shook her head. He's still paying my rent, actually, she said, glancing over at Combs at the defense table. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. This fact had already been disclosed, but hearing it again under cross-examination magnified its strangeness. Westmoreland feigned surprise. Oh, still paying you? That's quite something, she remarked with a thin smile. Despite you accusing him of heinous crimes in this court, he's continued to pay for your home. Generous man. The sarcasm was thinly veiled. The defense was insinuating that Jane might feel financially indebted to Combs, or that she had ulterior motives, perhaps even that this arrangement was a form of hush money that she reneged on, or conversely, that she was testifying falsely while happily taking his money. Jane flushed at the suggestion. I never asked him to keep paying, she said firmly, and it doesn't change what he did to me. The questioning grew more intense and personal. Westmoreland highlighted how Jane never went to the police, never told a doctor or friend about being forced into these encounters at the time. You only spoke up after Mr. Combs was arrested and other women had come forward, isn't that true? She asked pointedly. Jane admitted she had not gone to authorities earlier, her voice cracking as she explained she was terrified and felt trapped by loyalty and love. The defense attorney pressed on, suggesting that Jane's testimony was conveniently aligned with others and implying coordination or fabrication. At one point, Westmoreland's tone became biting. Did it ever occur to you that what you call forced were acts you in fact initiated or participated in willingly at the time? She referenced a message where Jane had texted Combs about hiring a particular escort she thought he'd like, painting Jane as an eager partner in crime. Jane stiffened. I texted him that because I knew it's what he wanted me to do, she shot back, a flash of anger in her voice for the first time all day. The tension between witness and lawyer was now crackling. Sensing the escalation, Prosecutor Comey objected to the last question as argumentative. Judge Subramanian sustained the objection, gently reminding Westmoreland to confine her questions to facts rather than speeches. The defense attorney adjusted her approach but remained unrelenting. Westmoreland's final gambit was perhaps the harshest. She posited to Jane, and by extension to the jury, that none of this was about justice for her, but rather about money and revenge. Realizing the attack might be backfiring, the defense attorney quickly wrapped up. In her last question, she attempted to sum up their theory. Jane, isn't it possible that what you're describing as forced were actually consensual acts that you regretted later? Jane met Westmoreland's eyes, her earlier shakiness gone. No, she said emphatically, steady and unflinching. I regretted it. Yes, but because I never wanted it in the first place, I just didn't know how to say no to him. Her voice did not waver. In that moment, the quiet strength in Jane's answer seemed to reverberate louder than any angry retort could have. Judge Subramanian, noting the lateness of the hour and the emotional fatigue evident on everyone's faces, decided to adjourn for the weekend. Court is done for the day, he announced briskly, instructing the jury to return Monday morning. Jane was told she could step down from the witness stand, but she would remain under oath as her time in the cross-examination hot seat was not yet finished. She will resume her testimony Monday, likely enduring several more hours of grilling by the defense. The judge kindly reminded Jane not to discuss her testimony with anyone in the interim. Jane nodded, clutching a bottle of water in one hand and the crumpled tissue in the other as she rose. For a moment, she looked unsure of where to go until a court officer gently guided her toward the witness room. Once the jury had filed out and only the legal teams remained, the defense sprang a final motion, a bid to strike certain pieces of Jane's testimony and evidence from the record. Combs' lead attorney, Mark Agnefello, argued that some of Jane's earlier statements and written notes about feeling financially beholden to Combs were prejudicial character evidence and not directly proof of a crime. In particular, the defense objected to the admission of Jane's unsent note and the testimony about the love contract, claiming these were irrelevant personal writings and agreements not germane to the specific charges. Prosecutor Comey countered forcefully that those pieces go to the heart of the coercion, demonstrating how Combs exerted pressure through money and psychological manipulation. Judge Subramanian listened intently to both sides' mini arguments, his brow furrowed as he thumbed through his trial notebook. Without issuing an immediate ruling, the judge indicated he was not inclined to exclude such evidence, but would take the matter under advisement over the weekend. The defense, for its part, has the weekend to regroup and strategize. Day 18 showed their approach, an aggressive attempt to paint Jane as a consenting adult who later revised history. They scored some points by highlighting her continued association with Combs and by hinting at motives like money or jealousy. Yet, observers noted that Jane remained composed and consistent under most of the pressure. She did not waver on the core allegations. If anything, some jurors appeared turned off by the defense's combative tone with a witness who had just openly wept on the stand. The judge's interventions to rein in the cross-examination could also tacitly signal to jurors which side was overstepping. There is a fine line between zealously defending one's client and appearing to bully an alleged victim. At the end of cross, the defense may have edged close to that line. As Sean Combs was escorted out by U.S. Marshals, his face a stoic mask betraying nothing, the remaining spectators exhaled collectively. In the gallery, a few of Combs' supporters sat in stunned silence, while on the other side, advocates for the accusers whispered with a sense of vindication.